"We sold your house, old lady." My ungrateful daughter mocked me, saying the beach house was gone, until she realized the deed was never in her name. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old, and I'm the mother of Sarah, 42, and Thomas, 39. So you can better understand this story, let me tell you how it all began. You know that moment when the ground disappears from under your feet? When you hear something so absurd that your mind simply refuses to process it? That's exactly what I felt that Sunday afternoon, sitting in my own living room, surrounded by people I raised, loved, and protected my whole life. The sentence came without warning, without mercy, without any sign of embarrassment. "We sold your house, old lady." Just like that, in plural, as if it were a collective decision I wasn't part of. The tone was almost festive, accompanied by a wide smile that seemed to say, "Surprise!" But it wasn't a good surprise. It was the kind of announcement that makes you question whether you really know the people around you. In that instant, I felt as though they'd ripped away not just a property from my name, but my very existence from the family equation. The word "old lady" echoed in my head like a slap in the face. It wasn't said with affection. It wasn't that loving nickname some families use. It was said with disdain, with that cruel naturalness of someone who no longer sees a person, but just an obstacle. My ungrateful daughter was right there, next to her husband, that gold-digger son-in-law who always had a strange gleam in his eyes when money was the topic. The two of them looked pretty satisfied with themselves, as if they'd just solved a complex problem. And the problem, apparently, was me. I looked around, searching for some sign of discomfort in the other faces, some indication that this was a bad joke, but I only found silent complicity. Everyone knew, everyone agreed, and no one thought it necessary to consult me. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? It's a strange feeling, almost surreal. There I was, an elderly mother who dedicated entire decades to family, being treated like a piece of furniture that can be discarded when it no longer serves the decor. The total humiliation wasn't just in the words, but in the certainty with which they were said. They weren't asking my permission. They weren't informing me with respect. They were simply communicating a done deal, like someone announcing that dinner's on the table. The beach house, that place that represented years of sweat, savings, and fulfilled dreams, had become just your house, as if I were a stranger living in something that never truly belonged to me. And the worst part? They talked about the money from the sale as if I'd already agreed to share it, to accept crumbs of what was rightfully mine. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts crossed my mind. How did we get here? When did I become disposable in the eyes of those I gave birth to? This is a real story, as painful as it is unbelievable, and I need you to understand every detail to comprehend the dimension of what happened next. Because that wasn't just the day they tried to steal a house from me. It was the day they tried to steal my dignity, my voice, and my right to exist as someone who still matters. They thought they were just reorganizing assets, redistributing goods, planning a more practical future. But what they were really doing was decreeing my death while I was still alive, pushing me to the margin of my own story. And you know what the most shocking part was? The tranquility with which they did it. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't make a scene like they probably expected, or maybe even wanted to paint me as the crazy, uncontrolled old woman. I simply stayed there, seated, processing every word, every gesture, every look of superiority. Inside, a storm was forming, but my face remained serene as the surface of a lake before the rain. They interpreted my silence as acceptance, as if age had made me too docile to question, too weak to react. Can you imagine the arrogance necessary to look into an elderly mother's eyes and simply announce that you sold something that was never yours to sell? It's an emotional story, not for the easy drama, but for the calculated coldness of those who think they're in absolute control. The room seemed smaller in that moment, the air heavier. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, every memory of that space I built with so much effort seemed to look back at me, questioning how we allowed ourselves to get to this point. My son was there too, quiet, staring at the floor as if the carpet were the most fascinating object in the world. He didn't actively participate in the cruelty, but his omission hurt as much as his sister's words. His silence was a veiled approval, an agreement that dispensed with words. And in that instant, I realized I wasn't just dealing with an ungrateful son or an ungrateful daughter, but with an entire system that had pushed me out of my own life. It was like watching a movie where you should be the protagonist, but the others rewrote the script and transformed you into an extra. But you know what's curious? In that moment of supposed defeat, something inside me began to awaken. It wasn't anger yet. That would be too simple. It was something deeper, clearer. It was lucidity, a crystalline clarity about who the people in front of me really were. That gold-digger daughter-in-law, always with sweet comments when she needed something, now showed her true face without any disguise. That gold-digger son-in-law, who praised my cooking and my hospitality, now called me old lady with naturalness. And my own daughter, the one who grew up hearing princess stories and happy endings, had become the villain of my real story. But unlike fairy tales, this story was just beginning, and the ending wasn't written yet. They continued talking, discussing details of the supposed transaction as if I weren't there. Values, deadlines, divisions, future plans. Each word was a new layer of disrespect, a new confirmation that I'd stopped being a person to become just a problem to be solved. And the more they talked, the more I observed. I observed the gestures, the subtext, the excessive certainty with which they handled matters that should be delicate. There was something strange about all that certainty, a conviction that seemed built on sand, not on rock. They talked about signed papers, about procedures already underway, about irreversible decisions. But something didn't fit, and it was in that something that my mind began to work, silently, methodically. When they finally got up to leave, after all, the mission was accomplished, the announcement made. I was still in the same place, in the same position. My ungrateful daughter gave me a cold little kiss on the forehead, one of those mechanical ones you give because social convention demands it, not because the heart asks for it. Her husband didn't even do that, just waved from afar with that satisfied smile of someone who just closed a good deal. My son mumbled a, "We'll talk later, Mom," that sounded more like an anticipatory apology than a real promise of dialogue. And then they left. The door closed, and the silence that remained was deafening. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before the storm, that moment of suspension where everything seems stopped, but is actually reorganizing itself for what comes next. I sat there for hours as afternoon turned into night. The streetlights began to turn on one by one, and I remained in the dark, not out of laziness to get up and flip the switch, but because that darkness seemed appropriate. This is an emotional story, because it shows how we can be surprised by the people we love most, and how total humiliation can, paradoxically, be the beginning of a transformation. In that silence, I began to mentally retrace every conversation from recent months, every apparently innocent comment about the beach house, every suggestion about making things easier, and thinking about the future. Everything was beginning to make sense now, like puzzle pieces fitting together to reveal an image I didn't want to see, but that was there all along. And it was there, in that dark room, in that profound solitude, that I made a decision. I wouldn't be passive. I wouldn't accept the victim role they tried to impose on me. If they wanted to play, I'd play too. But unlike them, I wouldn't act with impulse or emotion. I'd act with strategy, with method, with the wisdom that only years can bring. Because if there's one thing life taught me, it's that the underestimated always have a card up their sleeve. And my card had been saved for a long time, waiting for the right moment to be played. They thought they'd expelled me from my own story. Little did they know they were just beginning to understand what an elderly mother is capable of when tested to her limits. I finally got up, turned on the lights, and went to the office. There, carefully stored in a leather folder worn by time, were all the family's important documents: birth certificates, deeds, contracts. My fingers trembled not from fear, but from a strange anticipation as I searched for what I needed. And when I found it, when my eyes scanned those lines printed decades ago, a small smile, almost imperceptible, formed at the corner of my mouth. Because there, on that paper yellowed by time but still completely valid, was the truth that everyone had ignored. The truth that would change everything. But that's a story I'll tell calmly, at the right time. To understand why that phrase cut me so deeply, you need to know the story of the beach house. It wasn't just a property. It wasn't simply an investment or any old piece of real estate listed in cold documents. It was the result of years of sacrifice, of difficult choices, of dreams postponed and finally realized. Every brick of that construction carried memories that no one else seemed to remember or value. While my children grew up surrounded by comfort, enjoying vacations and carefree weekends, I worked in silence to ensure nothing was lacking. The house represented my independence, my security, my dignity transformed into something concrete and tangible. And it was precisely this achievement that began to bother certain people around me, especially that gold-digger daughter-in-law who always had a calculating look at what didn't belong to her. The real story begins decades ago, when I was still young and full of energy. My husband had died too early, leaving me alone with 2 small children and a world of responsibilities on my shoulders. I didn't have time to sink into mourning or self-pity. Life doesn't allow that luxury when you have mouths to feed and futures to build. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously for years. Early in the morning, before the sun rose, I was already up. At night, when the stars were already shining in the sky, I was still awake, planning the next day. My children never knew this because I never wanted them to carry the weight of our situation. For them, everything seemed to work magically. But there was no magic, just a mother determined not to let circumstances define our destiny. I saved every penny as if it were gold. While other people went out to dinner, I cooked at home. While neighbors traded cars every year, I kept the same modest vehicle running with careful maintenance. While friends bought new clothes, I renovated old ones with creativity. It wasn't greed, it was strategy. Every dollar saved was an invisible brick of the house I didn't yet know I'd build. The people around me thought I was just economical, but actually, I was building a future, stone by stone, sacrifice by sacrifice. This is an emotional story not because it involves wealth or luxury, but because it shows what a determined woman can achieve even when the whole world seems to conspire against her. And all of this, all that monumental effort, was ignored in a single cruel sentence. When I finally gathered enough money for the land at the beach, it was as if an impossible dream materialized before me. I remember the day I saw that piece of land for the first time. The sea breeze, the smell of salt in the air, the feeling that there, in that empty space, I could create something permanent. It wasn't a large plot or in a privileged location. It was what I could afford, but it was mine, completely, indisputably mine. No one gave it to me, no one lent it to me, no one made it easier. I conquered it with my own hands, with my own sweat, with my own choices. During construction, I personally followed every stage. The masons got used to my constant presence, to my detailed questions, to my insistence that everything be done right. Because that wasn't just a house, it was physical proof that I had won. My children loved that house when they were little. Beach vacations were always magical moments, full of laughter, playing in the sand, and family dinners on the porch while the sun set on the horizon. I'd watch them running happily and think it was worth it. Every extra hour worked, every sacrifice made, every difficult choice, everything was worth it for these moments. The house became the center of our most precious memories. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings. Those walls absorbed so much love, so much life, so much of us. But you know how it is, right? Children grow up, priorities change, and what was once valued begins to be seen with different eyes. My ungrateful daughter, who spent hours playing on that beach, now saw the house only as a financial asset. That gold-digger son-in-law, who'd never put a single penny into construction or maintenance, talked about it as if he had some right to that place. The comments started subtle, almost imperceptible at first. "Mom, do you still use this house much?" Or, "It must be a lot of work maintaining all this alone, right?" Seemingly innocent phrases, full of false concern. I always responded firmly that the house was fine, that I cared for it with love, that it wasn't work when you love what you do. But the questions continued, increasingly frequent, increasingly direct. My son, always more passive, never questioned directly, but also never defended me when his sister insinuated I should consider my options or think more practically about the future. The total humiliation didn't come all at once. It was a gradual process, a slow erosion of the respect I deserved, until the point where they felt comfortable simply announcing they'd sold what never belonged to them to sell. That house represented much more than walls and a roof. It was my security in old age, my guarantee that I'd never be a burden to anyone, my certainty that I'd always have a place that was undeniably mine. In a society that discards older people as if they were outdated objects, that property was my anchor, my proof of value. I didn't need to ask favors, didn't need to depend on the goodwill of children or daughters-in-law. I had my own assets, built with my own hands. And that independence, I realized too late, deeply bothered certain people. An elderly mother with her own resources doesn't fit into the convenient script of those who expect to inherit without effort. I was an obstacle to their plans, a piece that didn't move as expected on the board they thought they controlled. But there's something about that house that no one else knew, something I kept like a precious secret. During construction, when the documents were signed, when the deeds were registered, I made certain legal decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. Technical details no one paid attention to, clauses that seemed like unnecessary bureaucracy. I myself had almost forgotten these particularities until the day I heard that terrible phrase. That's when my memory lit up like a lamp in a dark room. Had they really checked everything? Was all that certainty built on solid foundations or on quicksand? This is an emotional story precisely because it shows how the details we ignore can become the most important pieces of the puzzle. The maintenance of that house was also all done by me. The bills, the repairs, the improvements over the years. No one ever asked if I needed financial or practical help. The house was simply always impeccable when they decided to show up to enjoy a weekend. It was as if it existed by magic, always ready, always perfect, always available. But magic doesn't pay electricity, doesn't fix leaks, doesn't paint walls worn by time. That was all me, working behind the scenes, invisible as I'd always been. And now, after decades keeping that place alive and beautiful, they simply decided it was time to liquidate the asset, as if it were a stock on the stock exchange and not a piece of my soul transformed into concrete. Every room in that house had a story. The porch where I drank coffee every morning, watching the sea and being grateful for another day. The bedroom where my grandchildren slept when they were still small and visited me frequently. The kitchen where I prepared thousands of meals, each made with love and dedication. The living room where important conversations happened, where laughter echoed, where life simply flowed in its most authentic form. How do you put a price on that? How do you sell memories, transform feelings into figures, negotiate pieces of your own history? For me, it was impossible. But for an ungrateful son, for an ungrateful daughter, for a gold-digger son-in-law and a gold-digger daughter-in-law, everything apparently had its price, and that price didn't include consideration for the feelings of the one who really mattered. So there I was, watching all this legacy be reduced to a cold commercial transaction. Years of work, sacrifice, and love converted into numbers in a supposed bank account that would be fairly divided. Fair to whom? Fair according to what criteria? They talked about fairness as if they had some moral right to it, as if their simple existences guaranteed them participation in something they never helped build. And the most ironic thing is that while I was raising them and working to give them a better life, they were learning values completely opposite to what I tried to teach. They learned that what matters is material gain, not effort, that the end justifies the means, that respect is optional when money's involved. But there was something they hadn't learned, something I was about to teach in the most impactful way possible. The beach house wasn't just property. It was a symbol. It was resistance. It was proof that a woman alone can build her own empire, even if it's a modest empire of 4 walls and a piece of land near the sea. And that lesson, that fundamental truth about dignity and independence, was about to be taught in the hardest way possible to those who thought they could simply take what didn't belong to them. Because there's something stronger than arrogance, more powerful than ambition. Truth. And the truth, as they'd soon discover, was documented, registered, protected by law. But they didn't know that yet. They were still savoring the false victory, celebrating prematurely, building castles on a foundation that would soon reveal its cracks. The change didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle, like a silent disease that spreads through the body without you noticing, until the symptoms become impossible to ignore. At first, It was just strange looks, that kind of expression that lasts a fraction of a second longer than it should. Then came the sideways comments, phrases said with a smile that didn't reach the eyes, words carefully chosen to sound like concern but carrying poison in the subtext. My ungrateful daughter began treating me differently, as if I were a child who needed to be guided about my own decisions. And that gold-digger son-in-law, who at least used to fake politeness, began looking at me with a mixture of impatience and disdain he didn't bother to disguise. Family gatherings became emotional minefields. Every conversation about the beach house was punctuated by exaggerated sighs, eye rolls, and comments about how certain things were complicating everyone's life. I still didn't completely understand what was happening, but I felt in the air this growing tension, this change in treatment, that made me uncomfortable in my own family's company. My son tried to maintain neutrality, but even he started avoiding my gaze when delicate subjects came up. This is a real story that thousands of elderly mothers live in silence when they realize that the respect they built over a lifetime is being eroded by the greed and selfishness of their own children. It's a total humiliation that happens gradually, stripping you of dignity layer by layer until you feel naked and vulnerable before those who should protect you. The hints became increasingly direct. Do you really need such a big house, Mom? Or wouldn't it be easier to sell and keep something simpler, more practical for your age? They always spoke as if they were genuinely concerned about my well-being. But I wasn't naive. I could hear what wasn't being said. You're holding on to something we want, and it's time to let go. That gold-digger daughter-in-law had a special talent for these poisoned conversations. She'd sit beside me, put her hand on my arm with false tenderness, and say things like, "Auntie, we just want what's best for you. It's so much responsibility maintaining that house." The auntie sounded fake, the touch was cold, and the words were pure manipulation disguised as care. Each phrase was an attempt to make me feel incapable, outdated, a burden that needed to be relieved. But the worst wasn't the words, it was the tone. That condescending tone we use with small children or people we consider mentally diminished. They began talking to me as if I were no longer capable of making rational decisions, as if age had erased my intelligence, along with the wrinkles marking my face. "We understand, Mom. It's hard to accept certain changes." Hard. They had no idea what hard was. Hard was raising 2 children alone. Hard was working to exhaustion to give them opportunities I never had. Hard was building something from nothing and keeping everything running for decades. But now, suddenly, I was the difficult person, the one who didn't understand, the one being irrational for wanting to keep what was mine. This is an emotional story because it exposes that family hypocrisy that so many prefer to pretend doesn't exist. The giggles began to appear, small, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. When I talked about my plans for the house, when I mentioned some improvement I wanted to make, when I simply expressed my love for that place, they'd exchange complicit looks, contained smiles, as if sharing an inside joke I wasn't part of. And maybe I wasn't. Maybe the joke was me, the foolish old woman who still thought she had a voice, who still thought her opinions mattered, who still hadn't realized they'd already decided her fate behind her back. An ungrateful son can hurt with silence, but an ungrateful daughter hurts with words disguised as concern. And the two together, supported by spouses as gold-digging as they were, form a devastating force against an elderly mother who just wants to live in peace with her achievements. The day came when I first heard that phrase that froze me. The beach house is done. It wasn't said to me directly. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, and they were talking in the living room, thinking I couldn't hear. But I heard. Every word, every syllable perfectly clear. The beach house is done. She just needs to accept it. They said it with naturalness, like someone commenting on a football game result. My hand trembled holding the cup. I felt the coffee almost overflow, but I managed to control myself. I took a deep breath, counted to 10, and continued preparing the tray. When I entered the living room, the silence was immediate and suspicious. Forced smiles appeared on faces. Conversations were abruptly changed to other subjects. But I knew something very wrong was being plotted, and that I was the only one who hadn't been invited to the planning meeting. From that moment on, every family interaction became a poorly rehearsed theater play. They tried to act normally, but the tension was palpable. I began to observe more, speak less. I noticed conversations that were interrupted when I entered the room. I noticed documents that were quickly put away when I approached. I saw warning looks being exchanged when I asked innocent questions about their plans. The total humiliation wasn't just in what they did, but in the fact that they didn't even care to hide it very well anymore. It was as if my opinion was so irrelevant that it wasn't even worth the effort of a well-told lie. I'd become a ghost in my own family, physically present, but absent from any real decision. And the cruelest part? They thought this was normal, that this was how things should be. Even my grandchildren started treating me differently. Children absorb everything, and they were absorbing their parents' disrespect. When I talked about the beach house, they'd roll their eyes the same way they saw the adults do. When I suggested we spend a weekend there, they'd make excuses with that rehearsed ease that only comes from repetition. This is an emotional story because it shows how poison spreads through generations, how disrespect is taught and learned, passed from parents to children as if it were an acceptable legacy. I was losing not just my house, not just my dignity, but also the love and respect of an entire generation I helped raise. And they did all this with smiles on their faces, as if they were heroes saving the poor old lady from herself. Visits became scarce. Before, even with all the tension, they still showed up regularly. But as their plans advanced, plans I still didn't know completely but felt in the subtext, visits decreased. When they came, it was always in a hurry, always with a ready excuse not to stay long. "Oh, Mom, we need to take care of some things," or "Can't today, we have an appointment." Always running, always escaping, always avoiding staying long enough for me to ask inconvenient questions. That gold digger son-in-law didn't even enter the house anymore. He'd stay in the car honking while my daughter quickly came in to give a mechanical kiss and rush out. My son called more than visited, and even the calls became short, objective, emptied of any real emotion. I felt like an old piece of furniture everyone wanted to discard, but didn't quite know how to do it without looking like terrible people. Because that's it, right? No one wants to be seen as a villain. We all want to believe we're good people making difficult choices for noble reasons. So they built narratives in their heads, elaborate justifications about why they were helping the elderly mother simplify her life. But it wasn't help. It was appropriation. It wasn't care. It was theft disguised as family concern. And the mockery, subtle but constant, was the tool they used to make me question my own sanity, my own capability, my own value. It was family gaslighting, a collective manipulation to convince me that I was the problem, not them. But there's a detail they didn't consider. A mother doesn't survive decades raising children, working, building assets, and keeping everything running by being naive or easily manipulated. You develop instincts, learn to read people, understand when you're being deceived, even if you can't pinpoint exactly how. And my instincts were screaming. Every giggle, every look of disdain, every condescending comment was a red flag blinking in my consciousness. Something big was coming, something they thought I couldn't prevent. They were building up to the big moment, to the final announcement that would put me in my proper place. Little did they know that this moment, when it came, would be the beginning of the end. Not for me, but for the fantasy of control they'd built. The mockery reached its peak at a family dinner I'll never forget. We were all gathered, and the subject inevitably turned to the house. My ungrateful daughter made a comment about how certain people get attached to material things in an unhealthy way, while looking directly at me. That gold-digger daughter-in-law completed it by saying, "Sometimes we need to help those we love make difficult decisions, even if they don't understand in the moment." And then they laughed. They laughed as if they'd told the funniest joke in the world. And I, sitting at the head of the table I myself had bought, in the house I myself maintained, surrounded by people I myself had fed, clothed, and educated, was the target of the joke. I didn't say anything in that moment. I just observed and waited. Because soon, very soon, we'd discover who would really have the last laugh in this story. Then that Sunday arrived. The day that would mark a definitive line between the before and after in my story. They asked for us to gather to talk about important family matters. The tone was serious, almost solemn, as if we were about to discuss something of extreme relevance that required everyone's presence. I accepted the invitation without suspecting the dimension of what was coming. Although my instincts had been on alert for weeks, I prepared an elaborate lunch, as I always did when the family gathered. I set the table beautifully, flowers in the center, everything perfect like an elderly mother who still values family moments. While I cooked, I heard laughter coming from the living room, animated conversations among them. It seemed like a normal day, a common family gathering. But there was something in the air, a strange electricity I couldn't name. After lunch, when we settled in the living room with coffee and dessert, the mood changed. Casual conversations ceased, smiles disappeared, and a theatrical seriousness took over the environment. My ungrateful daughter cleared her throat, a gesture she always made when she was about to say something rehearsed. My son was too quiet, staring fixedly at the floor as if he'd found something fascinating in the carpet pattern. That gold-digger son-in-law adjusted himself on the sofa with the posture of someone about to conduct a business meeting, and that gold-digger daughter-in-law had a little notebook in hand, as if she were going to take notes on something important. This is a real story that needs to be told in every detail, because it's in these details that true cruelty reveals itself. It wasn't just what they were about to say, but how they were organized, prepared, armed with arguments and false documents for a war I didn't even know had begun. "Mom, we need to talk about the beach house." The phrase came from my daughter, but it sounded rehearsed, robotic, as if she'd repeated it several times in front of the mirror before coming here. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "We know it's been difficult for you to maintain everything alone at your age." There it was again, the word age being used as a synonym for incapacity, as if I'd crossed some invisible line that automatically transformed me into someone incompetent. So we made a decision. Made. Not we made. They made. I wasn't included in the we, despite it being about my property, my achievement, my life. The total humiliation began in this simple choice of words, in this grammatical exclusion that reflected the real exclusion of any decision-making power over my own assets. And then came the bomb. We sold the beach house. The words floated in the air for a moment, as if time itself had paused to process the magnitude of what had just been said. Sold. Past tense. Done. Finished. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request for opinion. It was an announcement of something already concluded, or at least that's what they wanted me to believe. "It was the best decision for all of us," my daughter continued, as if explaining something obvious to someone particularly slow in reasoning. "The buyer already signed everything. The money will be divided fairly among the family." Among the family. As if the family were a separate entity from me, as if I were just an outside observer in this whole process. My son continued in silence, and that silence hurt more than any words he could have said. But the bigger shock was still to come. That gold-digger son-in-law pulled a folder from inside his bag and began spreading papers on the coffee table. "Here are all the documents," he said, with that tone of business efficiency he always used when he wanted to seem important. "Sales contract, property appraisal, distribution plan for the amounts." He spoke as if he were doing me a favor, as if he were being transparent and honest by showing me how they'd divided the money from the sale of my own property. This is an emotional story not for superficial drama, but for the calculated coldness with which people who should love me were executing what they believed to be a perfect plan. Each paper was a stab, each number a denial of my existence as an individual with rights and wishes of my own. I picked up the papers with slightly trembling hands, not from fear, but from a complex mixture of emotions I was still trying to process. I read each line, each clause, each value listed. Everything seemed so official, so definitive, so real. There were signatures, stamps, dates, a true documentary theater created to convince me I had no choice but to accept. "Your part is here," indicated that gold-digger daughter-in-law with false kindness, pointing to a value highlighted in yellow. "It's a good amount, Auntie. You can do a lot with this money." My part, of something that was entirely mine. As if they were giving me a generous slice of a cake they themselves had baked, when in reality, they were trying to give me crumbs of what I myself had created. An ungrateful son and an ungrateful daughter transformed my legacy into Excel spreadsheets and cold mathematical divisions. While I looked at those documents, they continued talking, explaining the practical reasons behind the decision, how the house was costing a lot to maintain, how I didn't use it that much anymore, how it would be easier for everyone to have liquid cash instead of a property just sitting there at the beach. Each justification was an additional layer of insult, as if I needed to be convinced that robbing me was, actually, an act of love and concern. And you know what the most disturbing part was? The absolute certainty they exhibited. There was no doubt in their eyes, no hesitation in their voices, no sign they considered the possibility of being wrong. They genuinely believed they had every right and every reason in the world to do what they were doing. This blind confidence would be funny if it weren't so tragic. My daughter continued with the rehearsed monologue. "We know it can be difficult at first, Mom, but it's what's best for you. The responsibility of taking care of a house that size isn't appropriate for your age anymore." There was the magic word again, age. As if upon completing a certain number of years, I'd automatically lost the capacity to make decisions about my own life. "Besides," added that gold-digger son-in-law, "the real estate market is good right now. If we waited longer, we could lose this opportunity." Opportunity for whom? Certainly not for me, who never expressed a desire to sell. This is an emotional story because it exposes how we justify terrible actions when they're convenient for us, how we build elaborate narratives to paint our selfishness as altruism. During all this time, I remained silent. Not because I had nothing to say, oh, I had a lot, but because something inside me whispered to wait, to observe, to let them finish their show before responding. They interpreted my silence the way that was most convenient for them. As acceptance, as submission, as the inevitable resignation of an elderly mother who finally recognized her powerlessness before the implacable logic of younger and wiser children. I saw in their eyes a gleam of victory, that satisfaction of someone who believes they've won a difficult battle. That gold-digger daughter-in-law even smiled at me, a smile she probably thought was comforting, but was just condescending. My son finally looked up, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw something there. Guilt, perhaps? Discomfort? But he quickly looked away, too cowardly to sustain the weight of his own betrayal. "So it's decided," concluded my daughter, with a tone of finality, as if closing a board meeting. "The money should come through in the next few weeks. We'll help you organize everything." Help. What an interesting word. Help implies assisting someone to do something that person wants to do. But none of that had to do with what I wanted. It was all about what they wanted, disguised as family concern. The total humiliation was complete, or at least they thought it was. They'd stripped me not just of a property, but of agency, of voice, of dignity. They'd transformed me into a child who needs adults to make decisions for her. And the worst, they did all this thinking they were being good children, helpful, caring. I observed each of them as they put away the papers, satisfied with a job well done. The confidence was palpable in the air. They were certain, absolutely certain, that everything was resolved, that the documents were legitimate, that the sale was real, that I had no choice but to accept my fate. And it was exactly in this excessive certainty that I noticed the fragility of their entire plan, because very confident people tend to verify less, question less, confirm less. They trust the appearance of things without examining the substance. And while they celebrated prematurely, while they congratulated themselves for the difficult decision they had to make, a small seed of something began to germinate inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It would become that later. It was something more powerful, clearer. It was absolute lucidity. And with that lucidity came a quiet certainty. This story was far, very far from over. I got up slowly, collected the papers they'd spread on the table, and said only, "I'm going to keep these to analyze calmly." My voice was surprisingly firm, without traces of emotion they could interpret or manipulate. They exchanged looks among themselves, probably surprised by my calmness, by the absence of tears or screams they might have expected. "Of course, Mom," said my daughter with that patronizing tone that had become her trademark. "Analyze all you want. But everything's already decided and signed, so—" The phrase hung in the air, unfinished, but the message was clear. You can look, but you can't change anything. They said goodbye with mechanical kisses and left, leaving me alone with a pile of false papers and a growing determination to discover exactly what was happening. Because one thing I knew for certain, something in that whole story didn't add up, and I was going to discover exactly what. After everyone left, I sat in that same room for hours. The afternoon transformed into night. The shadows lengthened along the walls, and I remained there, motionless, with that pile of papers in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone seeking comfort or advice. I thought with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years, as if all the initial shock had burned away the mists of my mind and left only the essential, the need to understand what was really happening. This is a real story where silence became my most powerful weapon, although at that moment they didn't know it. For my ungrateful daughter and that gold-digger son-in-law, my silence meant defeat. It meant I'd finally accepted my diminished place in the family hierarchy, that I'd surrendered to the inevitability of the situation. But they were completely wrong. The silence was strategy, not submission. Every second I remained quiet was a second they didn't discover what I was really thinking, planning, investigating. I learned over the years that people who talk too much reveal too much, and people who listen more learn more. So I listened. I heard every word they said, every elaborate justification, every detail they let slip while explaining their perfect plan. And while they spoke with that excessive confidence, my mind noted inconsistencies, weak points, flaws in the narrative they told. Because when you're too confident, you make mistakes. You assume things. You skip important steps. And they'd skipped something crucial. I could feel it in my gut, even without knowing yet exactly what. This is an emotional story because it shows that strength doesn't always come with volume, and power doesn't always need to be declared out loud. My son called the next morning. His voice was strange, loaded with something that seemed like guilt or discomfort. "Mom, are you okay? You were so quiet yesterday." Quiet. Interesting how he interpreted my lack of reaction as something worrying, not as what it really was, calculation. "I'm fine, son. Just processing everything," I responded with a calmness that even surprised me. There was no accusation in my voice, no trace of anger or hurt, just a neutrality that seemed to reassure him. "It's a lot of information at once, right? But you'll see it's for the best." He repeated the same litany as his sister, as if they'd memorized a script. "I'm sure," I said, and the conversation ended there, short, cordial, completely emptied of real emotion. When I hung up, a small smile touched my lips. They had no idea what was coming. During the following days, I maintained the same posture. When my daughter called to see how I was dealing with everything, I responded with short, empty phrases. "I'm fine, dear. Don't worry about me." When that gold-digger daughter-in-law sent messages feigning concern, I thanked her politely and changed the subject. Externally, I was the resigned elderly mother, graciously accepting her fate, grateful for the children's help in simplifying her life. But internally, every neuron in my brain was working at full capacity. I reread those documents every night, studied every line, every clause, every signature. And the more I read, the more questions arose. Dates that didn't make sense, references to documents I should have signed but didn't remember, technical details that seemed invented. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me was beginning to reveal itself as something much more sinister. A complete farce. I began making discreet calls, an old lawyer friend who'd helped me decades ago with the purchase of the land, an accountant who'd always taken care of my taxes, trustworthy people who had no connection to my children and who therefore wouldn't run to tell them what I was investigating. I asked careful, apparently innocent questions. I'm just trying to better understand some documents I received. Nothing that raised alarms, nothing that seemed suspicious. And with each conversation, with each answer I received, the puzzle began to form. The pieces fit together in a completely different way than my children had painted. This is an emotional story because it shows that age isn't synonymous with naivety, and experience is a much better teacher than presumptuous youth. Meanwhile, they continued with their lives, completely unconcerned. My ungrateful daughter even mentioned casually that she was already making plans for the money from the sale. "It'll be enough to do that renovation we wanted, finally?" She said this with enthusiasm, as if sharing good news with me, expecting me to rejoice in plans made with my assets. That gold-digger son-in-law began talking about investments, about how to multiply this capital intelligently. Capital. That's what he called the years of sacrifice and work that built that house. For him, it was just numbers, financial opportunities, assets to be managed. It was never about history, memory, dignity. It was just cold mathematics on a spreadsheet that existed only in his head and in the fraudulent documents they'd fabricated. My son was the only one who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the whole situation. In the rare times we spoke, there was hesitation in his voice, an avoidance of certain subjects. Part of me wanted to believe he had some remorse, some awareness of what they were doing. But another part, the more realistic part, recognized that discomfort isn't the same as action. He felt bad, but not bad enough to defend me, to question his sister, to verify if everything was really correct. An ungrateful son doesn't need to be active in his cruelty. Sometimes omission is as destructive as direct action, and his silence before his sister and brother-in-law's greed was his own form of betrayal, more subtle perhaps, but equally painful. This is a real story where I learned that family doesn't always mean loyalty, and blood isn't always stronger than greed. As the days passed, their confidence only increased. They began talking openly about the sale in my presence, without more filters or care. They discussed details of the supposed transaction, mentioned the buyer with naturalness, planned the fair division of money as if it were just a matter of time until everything materialized. And me? I just kept listening, vaguely nodding, maintaining that mask of passive acceptance they wanted to see. Each comment of theirs was an involuntary revelation. Each shared detail was more ammunition for me. They were so certain of their victory that they completely lowered their guard. It's amazing how intelligent people can be incredibly stupid when arrogance takes over. They'd underestimated me so completely, so absolutely, that they didn't even consider the possibility I was doing anything beyond meekly accepting my fate. That gold-digger daughter-in-law even told me, with that fake smile I'd learned to recognize, "Auntie, you're handling this so well. We were worried it would be harder, but I see you understand it really is for the best." Understand. What an interesting word. I understood much more than she imagined. I understood I'd been deceived, manipulated, robbed. I understood false documents had been created to convince me of something that never happened. I understood my own children had conspired against me with a coldness that still shocked me when I stopped to think about it. But I said none of this. I just smiled back, that small, neutral smile that revealed nothing. "Yeah, I'm understanding a lot of things lately," I responded. She didn't catch the double meaning. None of them caught it. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me was about to completely reverse, but they couldn't see the signs. Finally, after a week of discreet investigation, I spoke with the registry office where the house deed had been registered decades ago. The conversation started casual, almost nostalgic. "I'm revisiting old documents, you know how it is." The attendant was extremely helpful, searching through files, checking records, and then she said something that made my heart race. "Here it is. The deed in the name of..." And the name she said confirmed everything. Confirmed my suspicions, confirmed my hopes, confirmed I had a card up my sleeve that no one knew I possessed. I thanked her calmly, hung up the phone, and for the first time since that terrible Sunday, I allowed a genuine smile to form on my face. They'd skipped a crucial step in their farce. They'd assumed something without verifying, and that assumption would be their downfall. That night, I slept better than I'd slept in weeks. The weight of uncertainty had been replaced by the absolute clarity of truth. I knew exactly what was happening now. I knew the documents they showed me were false, or at least based on completely wrong premises. I knew the sale they announced with so much pomp had no legs to stand on. And most importantly, I knew the silence they confused with weakness had actually been the time I needed to gather all the necessary information. This is an emotional story not because the heroine screams or makes a scene, but because she observes, plans, and acts at the right time. And that time was approaching rapidly. Very soon, everyone would discover that underestimating an elderly mother can be the biggest mistake anyone can make, because age brings many things, and among them is patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment to act. I then began leaving small clues, subtle comments that planted seeds of doubt. "You know, I've been thinking about those documents you showed me." I'd leave the phrase hanging in the air, incomplete, loaded with meaning, but without saying anything specific. Or then, "It's funny, I don't remember signing certain things." Always casual, always vague, but enough to create a small discomfort. I saw in their eyes that first spark of uncertainty. Just a spark, still small, easily ignored, but it was there. The absolute confidence began showing its first cracks. They exchanged quick looks among themselves when I made these comments, looks that said, "Is she questioning?" followed by mutual reassurance. No, it's just the confusion of age. But the seed was planted, and as every good gardener knows, seeds need time to germinate. And I had all the time in the world. The moment arrived to tell the part that changed everything. The puzzle piece they never thought to look for because they were too convinced they already knew the whole story. Remember when I mentioned that during the house's construction, I made certain legal decisions that seemed insignificant at the time? Well, the time has come to reveal exactly what those decisions were. That night, alone in the office, with only the desk lamp illuminating the old documents, I found the original deed to the beach house. The paper was yellowed by time, the edges slightly worn, but every word printed there remained perfectly legible, and more importantly, perfectly valid. This is a real story where a piece of paper kept for decades would become the difference between being robbed and recovering not just my property, but my dignity. And as my eyes traced those familiar lines, a smile kept growing on my face. The deed was in my name, completely, indisputably, legally in my name. There were no names of my children as co-owners. There was no clause that gave them automatic rights over the property, no legal loophole that could justify what they claimed to have done. The house had always been mine, only mine. From the first brick to the roof, from the purchase of the land to the final registration at the registry office, every signature was mine. Every stamp confirmed my exclusive ownership. So how had they managed to sell something that never belonged to them? The answer was simple and brutal. They hadn't. The supposed sale was a farce, built on lies, falsified or ill-intentioned documents, and the arrogant presumption that an elderly mother wouldn't have the capacity or courage to verify the truth. That gold-digger son-in-law and that gold-digger daughter-in-law had completely underestimated the woman who now held in her hands the irrefutable proof of their own fraud. I reread the deed 3 times, 4 times, making sure I wasn't interpreting it wrong, that there wasn't some hidden clause I'd forgotten. But no, it was crystal clear, black and white, unquestionable. The property was registered solely and exclusively in my name, without any sharing of ownership. This meant that any attempt to sell without my notarized signature would be not just invalid, but potentially criminal. This is an emotional story because the moment of discovery didn't come with fanfare or excessive drama. It came with the cold and precise clarity of documentary truth. It wasn't my feelings against theirs. It wasn't my word against theirs. It was the law, objective and impartial, confirming what I suspected. They'd built an entire castle of lies on a foundation that simply didn't exist, and castles without foundation collapse. But how had they come to believe they could do this? That's when I began putting the pieces together. Years ago, when my husband died, there were conversations about inheritances, about how to organize things, in case something happened to me. At the time, I vaguely mentioned that the house would eventually be theirs, as is natural for parents to tell their children, but eventually doesn't mean now. After my death isn't the same as when you decide. They'd taken these casual conversations, these future promises, and transformed them into a narrative where they already had present rights over the property. They added to this falsified documents, probably invented sales contracts, forged receipts, maybe even imitated signatures, and then they presented everything to me as a done deal, betting I'd be submissive or confused enough not to question it. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me was based on the belief that an elderly mother wouldn't have the lucidity to unmask their farce. I called my lawyer again, this time with a different purpose. I need to confirm something important, I said, and explained the whole situation. I sent photos of the original deed by email, along with copies of the false documents my children had presented to me. There was a long pause after he analyzed everything. Then his voice came loaded with a mixture of indignation and professional concern. This is fraud, potentially even document falsification. Without your notarized signature, no sale is valid. The property remains entirely yours. Each word was a confirmation. Each phrase reinforced what I already knew but needed to hear from a specialist. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "First," I responded calmly, "I want to be absolutely certain of all the facts. Then, I'll confront them. But in my time, in my way. This is a real story where justice doesn't need to be fast to be effective. Sometimes the wait makes the lesson even more impactful." I spent the next days collecting every piece of evidence I might need. notarized copies of the original deed, proof that I'd always paid all the property taxes alone without anyone's contribution, receipts for maintenance, renovations, water and electricity bills, everything in my name, everything paid by me. I built a complete dossier that left no room for doubt about who was the legitimate and sole owner of that house. And while I did this, my children continued acting as if everything was resolved. My ungrateful daughter even commented about going to the house for the last time before the change of ownership. That gold-digger daughter-in-law talked about making good use of the money that's coming. They lived in an alternate reality, a bubble of self-delusion that was about to burst spectacularly. But I wasn't in a hurry. Each day that passed in silence was one more day they deepened their own trap. The most fascinating thing was observing how they'd convinced themselves of their own narrative. It wasn't just a cold, calculated plan. They genuinely believed they had a right to that house, that they were just anticipating the inevitable, that they were doing a favor by simplifying things before I became too old to understand. This is an emotional story because it shows how people can distort reality to justify their own desires. They didn't see themselves as villains. They didn't consider themselves thieves or manipulators. In the narrative they built in their minds, they were the practical heroes, solving problems, taking care of a mother who no longer had the capacity to care for herself. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. How do you steal from someone and still sleep peacefully at night? Simple. You convince yourself it's not theft. My son finally came to visit me alone, without his sister. He sat in front of me with that uncomfortable expression that had become permanent in recent weeks. Mom, I know all this was difficult, but you understand it really is for the best, right? I looked at him, this adult man I brought into the world, raised, loved unconditionally. An ungrateful son who didn't have the courage to defend me, who let his sister's greed and his brother-in-law's influence dictate the family's actions. Part of me wanted to scream, reveal everything right there, show the deed and watch his face crumble when he realized the magnitude of the mistake they were making. But I restrained myself. It wasn't the moment. It wasn't the right way to do it. I understand a lot of things, son, I responded, and there were so many layers of meaning in that phrase he'd never capture. More than you imagine. The truth about the deed was my trump card, but I knew I needed to play it at the right time, in the right way, with maximum impact. It wasn't enough to simply say, "You're wrong." It needed to be a public revelation, in front of everyone, where they couldn't run, couldn't create quick excuses, couldn't manipulate the narrative afterward. I wanted them to sit there, in front of the whole family, with all the arrogant confidence they'd been displaying, and then be confronted with the documented and irrefutable reality that they'd built an entire scheme on a fundamental lie. The total humiliation wouldn't be mine. It would be theirs. And unlike the humiliation they tried to impose on me, this would be based on truth, not manipulation. It would be justice, not cruelty. It would be consequence, not revenge. Although, I admit, the line between these concepts was getting increasingly thin. So I scheduled a family meeting. "We need to talk about the next steps," I said on the phone, with a neutral and cooperative voice. My daughter was visibly relieved. "Oh, that's good, Mom. I was worried about your silence. I thought you were upset." Upset was such an inadequate euphemism, I almost laughed. "No, dear. I've just been thinking and organizing everything. I think it's time we have a definitive conversation about this." She agreed enthusiastically, probably interpreting my cooperation as final resignation. That gold-digger son-in-law even commented in the background, "Great, let's resolve everything at once." Resolve. Yes, we were going to resolve, but not the way they imagined. This is an emotional story because sometimes the greatest strength lies in silent preparation, in strategic patience, in waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. In the days leading up to the meeting, I organized all the documents with meticulous care. The original deed in a separate folder, the payment receipts in another, copies of the false documents they presented me in a third. Each piece of evidence had its place. Each proof was ready to be presented at the appropriate moment. I also made sure to have a witness present. I invited my lawyer to be there as a legal consultant to help understand the procedures. They didn't suspect anything. Why would they? After all, in their heads, I was just finally accepting the inevitable and wanting professional help to properly process the transaction. Their confidence remained unshakable. And the more confident they were, the sweeter the revelation would be. Because truth, when finally revealed, has a weight no lie can bear. And the weight of the truth I carried was about to completely crush the fragile fantasy they'd built. The night before the meeting, I slept surprisingly well. There was no nervousness, just a tranquil certainty that I was doing the right thing. For the first time in weeks, since that terrible Sunday, I felt I was regaining control of my own story. I was no longer the passive victim of decisions made by others. I was the protagonist, about to rewrite the ending they tried to impose. And while I slept, my children probably also slept peacefully, dreaming about the money they'd receive, about the plans they'd make, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to fall on their heads. An elderly mother, an old deed, and the simple but devastating truth. The house had always been mine, and no one, absolutely no one, had the right to take that from me. The story was far from over. In fact, the best chapter was just beginning. The days leading up to the decisive meeting were fascinating to observe. I began letting small questions slip, apparently innocent comments that carried a weight only I knew. During a casual dinner at my daughter's house, while everyone talked animatedly about their future plans, I casually dropped, I've been reviewing some old documents these days. It's curious how memory plays tricks on us, isn't it? My ungrateful daughter's smile trembled imperceptibly. What documents, Mom? She asked, trying to keep her tone light. Oh, old things from the registry office. Deeds, records, all those things. I let the phrase float in the air, without elaborating, just observing the reactions. That gold-digger son-in-law exchanged a quick look with my daughter. It was just a second, a fraction of a moment, but it was there, the first sign of discomfort. This is a real story where every small action had a purpose. Every word was carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt. The next day, I called my son. I kept the conversation casual, asking about his work, family, everyday things. Then, almost as an afterthought, I commented, "Oh, something that came to mind. Do you happen to know who signed the sale documents? I don't remember going to the registry office to notarize anything." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause too long to be natural. I think we took care of everything, Mom. Don't worry about it." His voice was strange, tense. An ungrateful son trying to maintain the farce, but the confidence in his voice was no longer the same as weeks ago. "Ah, I see," I responded softly. "It's just that normally, these things need a notarized signature, right? At least that's how it was when I bought the house." More silence. "Let's talk better at the meeting, okay, Mom?" He ended the call quickly, clearly uncomfortable. This is an emotional story because it shows how truth has a way of infiltrating consciences, even when we try to ignore it. I noticed they began meeting more frequently without me. WhatsApp messages flew between them. I couldn't see the content, but I saw my daughter on the phone constantly, typing frantically, with an increasingly worried expression. That gold-digger daughter-in-law no longer had that fake, condescending smile when she saw me. There was something different in her eyes now, uncertainty. My son avoided calls, responding only with short, evasive messages. The confidence they radiated weeks ago was being replaced by something more fragile, more nervous. They were beginning to wonder if they'd checked everything, if they'd covered all the bases, if they really knew all the details they thought they knew. One afternoon, I ran into my daughter on the street by chance. Or maybe it wasn't so much by chance. She had that expression of someone who hadn't slept well. Dark circles makeup couldn't completely hide. "Mom, what a coincidence!" Her enthusiasm sounded forced. We talked briefly about trivialities, but then she couldn't resist. "Mom, about those documents you mentioned, did you find anything strange?" The word strange hung between us like an unspoken confession. I smiled gently. "Strange? Depends on what you consider strange, dear. I found very interesting things, that's for sure. Things that clarify the whole situation quite a bit." Her face visibly paled. "What kind of things?" Her voice had lost all its previous arrogance. "Let's talk about it at the meeting," I responded, echoing my son's words. "It'll be better to discuss everything with everyone present, don't you think?" The total humiliation they tried to impose on me was beginning to reverse. That gold-digger son-in-law also began showing signs of nervousness. He'd always been the most calculating of the group, the one who seemed to have all the answers, all the financial justifications. But now, when we made eye contact, I saw something different. There was an analysis happening behind those eyes. He was reassessing, recalculating, trying to figure out exactly what I knew and what it could mean for their plans. One night, he even called my house, something he'd never done before. "Hi, mother-in-law. Everything okay?" The term mother-in-law sounded particularly fake coming from him. "Look, I was thinking here, are you sure you're comfortable with this whole house situation? Because if you have any doubts, we can review everything again." Interesting. Now he wanted to review. Now there was room for doubts. "Don't worry," I responded calmly. "I'm absolutely certain about everything. In fact, I've never been so sure of anything in my entire life." The cracks in their facade of confidence became more visible each day. During a family lunch that happened a few days before the crucial meeting, the tension was almost tangible. They tried to maintain normal conversations, but everything seemed rehearsed, forced. My ungrateful daughter laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. My son barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate while staring into space. That gold-digger daughter-in-law maintained a fixed smile on her face that didn't come close to her eyes. And that gold-digger son-in-law was constantly on his phone, as if checking things, confirming details, trying to patch holes that were beginning to appear in their plan. This is an emotional story not for screams or big drama, but for the growing tension, for the subtle but undeniable change in power dynamics. They were beginning to realize they might have underestimated the elderly mother they thought they controlled so easily. In a particularly revealing moment, I was in the kitchen preparing coffee when I heard whispers coming from the living room. I approached silently. I wasn't spying after all. It was my own house. "Are you sure you checked everything properly?" It was my daughter's voice, low but intense. "I told you yes. The documents are all—" Her husband's voice. "But what if she really found something? You saw how she's acting. She's just being dramatic. Old woman wanting attention." His answer was harsh, but I could hear the uncertainty behind the arrogance. "I don't know. She's different. Very calm, very confident." My son spoke for the first time. They'd finally noticed. They'd finally realized something had changed, that the submissive mother they expected wasn't who was really there. I returned to the kitchen with a smile. The total humiliation they planned for me was about to become theirs. The gold-digger daughter-in-law tried a different approach. She came to visit me alone, bringing flowers and cookies, all smiles and fake sweetness. "Auntie, I came here because I'm worried about you. You seem tense lately." Tense. What a curious word coming from someone who actively participated in a plan to rob me. "I'm fine, dear. Actually, I've never been better." She sat down, leaning forward with that expression of false intimacy. "It's just that we don't want you to feel pressured or confused about anything. If you have any questions about the house procedures—" "I don't have questions," I interrupted gently but firmly. "I have certainties, and all of them will be shared at the meeting." Her face fell. "What kind of certainties?" Her voice went up an octave. "Patience," I smiled. "Very soon everyone will know." She left visibly shaken, and I'm sure before she got home, she was already calling my daughter, reporting the conversation. This is a real story where power doesn't come from screams or threats, but from the tranquil possession of truth, and truth is an impossible force to contain or control. The more they tried to understand what I knew, the more obvious it became they'd made a crucial error somewhere. The unshakable confidence they displayed when they announced the sale was completely undone now. In its place, there was nervousness, doubt, fear. They were beginning to realize the game had changed, that the rules weren't what they thought, that the old woman they underestimated had cards they didn't know about. And the best part? They still had no idea what exactly the card was I held. They only knew there was something that had transformed my previous silence from submission into unshakable confidence. And that uncertainty was eating them from the inside. On the morning of the meeting, I received an unexpected call. It was my daughter, and for the first time in months, her voice had a tone I hadn't heard in a long time. Real vulnerability. "Mom, can we need to talk before the meeting." There was a pause. "Please?" That please carried so much weight, so much poorly disguised fear. For a moment, just a moment, my mother's heart almost gave in. I almost suggested we could resolve everything privately, avoid the public embarrassment. But then I remembered the mockery, the giggles, the "we sold your house, old lady," said with so much disdain. I remembered each humiliation, each disrespect, each moment they treated me like an inconvenient nuisance. "No, dear," I responded calmly. "Everything that needs to be said will be said with everyone present. After all, that's how you did it, wasn't it? You gathered everyone to tell me about the sale. Only fair that the next conversation be the same way." The silence on the other end of the line was eloquent. That gold-digger son-in-law made one last desperate attempt. He showed up at my door an hour before the scheduled meeting. "Mother-in-law, I came here because—" "Look, if there's any problem with the documents, any technical error, we can resolve it amicably, without involving lawyers or making a scene." Ah, so that was it. He was already thinking about lawyers, about scenes. This meant they'd discussed among themselves the possible implications if something was really wrong. "There's nothing to resolve amicably," I responded. "Either there is something, or there isn't. Truth is binary. There's no middle ground. And the truth will be known by everyone shortly." He tried a few more approaches, offering to review the numbers, suggesting other forms of division, insinuating we could avoid unnecessary embarrassments. Each offer was an admission they knew, deep down, something was very wrong. And the more he talked, the clearer it became the castle of lies was crumbling even before the meeting began. When everyone finally arrived for the meeting, the atmosphere was completely different from that Sunday when they announced the sale. There were no confident smiles. There wasn't that casual arrogance. There was tension, exchanged looks, a palpable nervousness in the air. My ungrateful daughter entered, avoiding my gaze. My son looked 10 years older, carrying the weight of guilt and uncertainty. That gold-digger daughter-in-law and that gold-digger son-in-law tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it was obvious they were deeply uncomfortable. And there I was, seated calmly in the same room where weeks ago I'd been humiliated and disrespected, but now with a folder of documents by my side and my lawyer seated discreetly in the corner. The tables had turned, and they knew. Oh, how they knew. They still weren't sure how much I knew, how deep the hole was they'd dug for themselves, but the unshakable confidence had been replaced by growing fear, and this was just the beginning. I let the silence extend for a few moments, observing each of them, reading their expressions, their unspoken fears. This is an emotional story because it shows that sometimes justice doesn't need to be fast, it needs to be complete, and complete justice was about to be served. Finally, I opened the folder in front of me, and the sound of paper being handled seemed to echo like thunder in the silent room. "Well," I began, my voice calm and firm, "since you were so kind to gather me weeks ago to discuss the future of my property, I thought it fair to return the courtesy. Today, we're finally going to have a conversation about the truth, the complete, documented, and irrefutable truth. And when we're done, everyone here will understand exactly what happened, what almost happened, and most importantly, what will never happen." Their faces paled. Their certainty had completely crumbled. Now it was my turn. The silence in the room was so dense it seemed solid, tangible. All eyes were fixed on me, some with nervous curiosity, others with poorly disguised fear. My lawyer remained seated discreetly, a silent but significant presence that already communicated this wouldn't be a casual family conversation. I took a deep breath, not from nervousness, but from the weight of the moment I was about to live. This was the scene I'd mentally rehearsed hundreds of times, but now that it had finally arrived, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. Anticipation for the justice that would come, sadness, because this represented an irreparable break in the family I tried to build with so much love. "You must be wondering why I requested this meeting," I began, keeping my tone measured and calm, "and why I brought a lawyer with me. So let's get straight to the point. No beating around the bush. This is a real story where truth would finally have its moment, without filters, without half-truths." I picked up the first document from the folder, the original deed to the beach house, and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see. The paper, yellowed by time, contrasted with the newer, shinier documents they'd presented to me weeks ago. "This," I said, touching the document reverently, "is the original deed to the beach house, registered more than 20 years ago at the competent registry office, with all authenticated signatures and all necessary legal seals." I paused, observing the faces around the table. My ungrateful daughter was pale, her hands intertwined so tightly her knuckles turned white. That gold-digger son-in-law tried to maintain a neutral expression, but a drop of sweat began to form on his forehead. Would you like to guess in whose name this property is registered? No one answered. It's in my name, exclusively in my name. There are no co-owners, there's no division of ownership, there's no clause that gives third parties automatic rights over the property. That gold-digger daughter-in-law was the first to try to speak, her voice coming out a bit too high-pitched. But Auntie, we know that. Obviously it's in your name. That's why you what? I interrupted gently but firmly. That's why you sold it? See, here's the fundamental problem with your story. I picked up the false documents they'd presented to me and placed them beside the original deed. The contrast was striking when you knew what to look for. These documents you showed me, claiming the sale was already concluded, are based on a completely false premise. You assumed, or worse, deliberately lied, that you had authority to sell a property that doesn't belong to you. The lawyer beside me nodded silently, confirming every word I said. This is an emotional story because the moment of truth didn't come with screams or melodrama, but with the irrefutable force of legal documents and impeccable logic. My son finally found his voice, though it came out weak and hesitant. Mom, but you said, years ago, you mentioned the house would be ours eventually. Eventually, I repeated the word, letting it float in the air. That's the key word, isn't it? Eventually. After my death, as part of the inheritance, I, yes, planned to leave you, but eventually doesn't mean now. After my death isn't the same as when you decide it's convenient. I looked directly at him, this ungrateful son who never had the courage to defend me, but had enough courage to silently participate in the scheme. I'm still alive. I'm still completely capable of making my own decisions, and I definitely never authorized any sale. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me was now reflected in their faces, which were beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they'd done. Furthermore, I continued, picking up another set of documents, for any property sale to be legally valid, the authenticated signature of the registered owner is required. Can you show me where my notarized signature is on these sale documents you claim exist? Absolute silence. You can't, because it doesn't exist, because this sale never happened. You invented a transaction, created false or misleading documents, and tried to convince me it was real, betting I'd be too confused or submissive to verify. My ungrateful daughter tried to speak, but I raised my hand. I'm not finished yet. You gathered me, sat me in this very room, and announced with smiles on your faces that you'd sold my house, my achievement, my legacy, as if it were a joke. We sold your house, old lady. Remember? I saw tears begin to form in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry. Not yet. That gold-digger son-in-law finally tried to defend himself, his voice loaded with false indignation. Look, if there was any misunderstanding about legal procedures— Misunderstanding? My voice remained calm, but there was steel in it now. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud. And my lawyer here can confirm that falsifying property sale documents, forging signatures, or creating false contracts are serious crimes. The lawyer inclined his head, confirming. That gold-digger son-in-law visibly paled. Now, I continued, I'm not saying I'm going to sue you. I haven't made that decision yet, but I want you to understand perfectly the gravity of what you did. This is a real story where the line between family justice and legal justice was dangerously thin, and they were beginning to realize exactly which side of that line they'd fallen on. I then picked up another pile of documents. These are proof of all property tax payments for the last 20 years, all in my name, all bills paid exclusively by me. I spread them on the table. Here are receipts for all renovations, maintenance, improvements made to the house over the years, all paid by me. Did you contribute a single penny to maintaining this property? No one answered. No, you didn't. But you enjoyed the house whenever you wanted, used it as if it were a private hotel, and now you tried to sell it as if you had any right to it. That gold-digger daughter-in-law stared fixedly at her own hands, unable to raise her eyes. You didn't just try to steal a property from me. You tried to steal my dignity, autonomy, voice. You tried to reduce me to an incapable old woman who needs younger and wiser children to make decisions for her. My ungrateful daughter finally broke into tears. Mom, we thought we were helping. Helping? My voice rose for the first time, loaded with all the accumulated pain and anger. Helping by treating me like an incompetent child? Helping by mocking me behind my back? Helping by deciding my future without even consulting me? I took a deep breath, recovering my composure. You weren't helping. You were taking advantage. You were anticipating an inheritance that doesn't belong to you yet, treating a living mother as if she were already dead and buried. The words were harsh, but necessary. This is an emotional story because sometimes true love requires painful truths, and protecting someone from consequences isn't protection. It's complicity. And worst of all, I continued more softly now, is that you did this thinking you were smart, that you'd thought of everything, that an elderly mother would be easy to deceive. My son tried to speak, his voice broken. Mom, I'm sorry. I should have defended you. Yes, I agreed, looking directly at him. You should have. An ungrateful son doesn't need to lead the cruelty. Sometimes simply allowing it to happen is cruelty enough. He lowered his head, unable to sustain my gaze. I returned my attention to all of them. So here's what's going to happen now. The beach house continues being mine, exclusively mine. There will be no sale, there will be no division, there will be no negotiation. The property remains exactly as it is, registered in my name, under my absolute control. I paused, letting this sink in. And as for the future, as for the inheritance you'll receive one day, well, that's something I'll need to carefully reconsider. Because today, I discovered the children I raised aren't the people I thought they were. That gold digger son-in-law tried one last desperate play. Look, if the issue is money, we can compensate in other ways. It's not about money! My voice cut through the air like a blade. It was never about money. It's about respect. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that a mother who worked her whole life to give you everything still deserves to be treated like a human being with her own will, not like an inconvenient obstacle to your financial plans. The silence that followed was absolute. Even sounds coming from the street seemed to have ceased. You treated me like a disposable old woman. You mocked me, humiliated me, tried to deceive me. And you did all this with smiles on your faces, convinced you were being intelligent, practical, even kind. I shook my head, sadness finally leaking through the anger. But the greatest tragedy isn't what you tried to do to me. It's what you did to yourselves. This is an emotional story because it shows that sometimes winning doesn't bring joy. It just brings the bitter validation of being right about something we'd prefer to be wrong about. I could sue you, I said finally. My lawyer prepared a solid case. Fraud, falsification, attempted misappropriation. There are several nice legal names for what you did. I saw real panic in their eyes now. But I won't. You know why? Because despite everything, I'm still your mother. And a mother, even an elderly mother who was disrespected and betrayed, still loves her children even when they don't deserve that love. Tears ran freely down my daughter's face now, and even my son had watery eyes. But that love has limits. And you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The trust I spent decades building was destroyed in weeks. And trust, unlike houses, can't simply be rebuilt with money and late good intentions. I gathered all the documents back into the folder, each movement deliberate and final. This meeting is over. You now know the complete truth. You know the house remains mine, that it never stopped being mine, and that you never had any right to do what you tried to do. I stood up, my lawyer doing the same. I'm going to need time to decide what my next step will be, whether there will be any kind of possible reconciliation or if the damage is irreparable. But one thing is certain. I'll never again be treated as someone whose opinion is optional, whose existence is inconvenient, whose will can be ignored. I looked each of them in the eyes. One last time. You tried to give me the last word about the house, but you discovered, too late, that the last word was always mine, because in the end, truth always has the last word, and today, truth spoke. The total humiliation wasn't mine, it was theirs, and unlike the one they tried to impose on me, this one was deserved, documented, and sadly, necessary. When I finished speaking, no one moved. It was as if everyone had transformed into statues, frozen in the exact moment reality finally hit them with full force. The silence that filled the room was completely different from the one I kept weeks ago. That was my silence, calculated, strategic, powerful. This was their silence, devastated, ashamed, defeated. My ungrateful daughter had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to contain. My son stared fixedly at nothing, as if watching his whole life pass before his eyes and not liking what he saw. That gold-digger son-in-law had lost all corporate arrogance, suddenly seeming smaller, shrunken in his chair. And that gold-digger daughter-in-law was pale as a ghost, finally understanding they'd bet everything on a bluff and lost spectacularly. This is a real story, where the moment after truth is revealed is as important as the revelation itself. My lawyer was the first to move, discreetly collecting his own documents and preparing to leave. Before going, he placed his hand gently on my shoulder, a small gesture, but one that communicated support and respect. "If you need anything, any additional clarification, you can call me," he said in a low voice, but loud enough for everyone to hear. It was a subtle but potent reminder this wasn't just family drama. It had legal weight, real consequences. After he left, the silence somehow became even heavier. It was as if his professional presence had kept everyone composed, and now that he was gone, the true emotional magnitude of the situation could finally explode. But no one screamed, no one protested, no one tried to argue or justify, because there was nothing left to say. Truth had been exposed, complete and irrefutable. Finally, my daughter raised her face. Her eyes were red and swollen, makeup smeared by tears. "Mom!" Her voice came out strangled, loaded with pain. "Mom, I don't know what to say." I looked at her, this adult woman who was still my little girl underneath all the greed and ambition that had corrupted her. Part of me wanted to comfort her, say everything would be okay, wipe her tears like I did when she was a child. But the stronger part, the part that had been hurt so deeply, knew this would be a disservice to both of us. "Then don't say anything," I responded calmly. "Because in this moment, there are no words that can fix what was broken. Apologies are cheap when they come too late." She sobbed harder, but I didn't move to comfort her. This is an emotional story, because it shows that a mother's love doesn't mean protecting children from the consequences of their own actions. Sometimes, it means letting them face those consequences fully. My son tried to speak several times, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Finally, he managed to force the words. "I never wanted. I should have." "Should have what?" I asked, my voice surprisingly gentle considering the situation. "Should have defended me? Should have questioned your sister? Should have verified the facts before assuming a fraud was legitimate?" Each question was a stab of truth. Yes, you should have done all that. An ungrateful son doesn't need to be the active villain to cause damage. Sometimes omission is as destructive as action. He closed his eyes, tears finally escaping through closed lids. "You were the only one who had a chance to stop this from the beginning, but you chose the comfort of neutrality instead of the courage of loyalty. And now, we all pay the price for that choice." That gold-digger son-in-law tried to recover some composure, clearing his throat and straightening his shoulders in a pathetic attempt to seem professional. "Look, clearly there were serious communication errors here. Maybe we can—" "Communication errors?" I repeated the phrase, letting its absurdity float in the air. "You can wrap this in all the corporate language you want, but in the end it doesn't change what happened. You tried to rob me, period. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a communication error, it wasn't a mistaken interpretation. It was a deliberate and calculated attempt to appropriate something that didn't belong to you." He opened his mouth to respond, but a look from my daughter made him close it again. Even in the middle of disaster, she at least had enough awareness to realize he'd only make things worse if he continued talking. The total humiliation was written in every line of his face. That gold-digger daughter-in-law was even more pathetic in her attempt to save the situation. With a trembling and falsely sweet voice, she whispered, "Auntie, we really thought we were doing what's best for you. The house is so big, so much responsibility." "Stop." My voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't further insult my intelligence by trying to sell that narrative that you did this for me. You did it for yourselves, for the money, for financial opportunities, and it's okay to admit greed. It's human. But don't try to paint greed as altruism. Don't try to transform theft into care." She immediately fell silent, realizing anything she said would only dig the hole deeper. This is a real story where the masks finally fell completely. and what remained was just the naked and raw truth about who these people I'd loved unconditionally really were. The silence extended for minutes that seemed like hours. No one knew what to do or say. It was as if everyone was waiting for me to release them, to give permission for them to leave, and begin the process of dealing with what they'd done. But I wasn't in a hurry. I let the discomfort deepen, let them sit with the weight of their own actions, let reality penetrate every corner of their consciences. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Because if I relieved the pressure now, if I let them escape easily from this moment, the lesson would be lost. And this was a lesson that needed to be learned deeply, viscerally, in a way that would never be forgotten. The silence was part of the education, part of the process of really understanding what they'd done and why it was so profoundly wrong. Finally, I stood up from the chair. The movement broke the trance everyone seemed to be in. "You can go now," I said simply. My ungrateful daughter looked at me with desperate hope in her eyes. "Mom, can we talk about this? Try to fix it?" I shook my head slowly. "Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe never. I need time to process what I discovered. Not just about the attempted fraud, but about who you've become. I need to decide if I still recognize my children in these people who tried to deceive me so naturally." The pain on her face was real, but I had my own pain to deal with. "When and if I'm ready to talk again, I'll get in touch. Until then, I need you to respect my space and my decision." This is an emotional story because it shows that forgiveness isn't automatic, that reconciliation isn't mandatory, and that even a mother's love has limits that, when crossed, require time and space to heal. They got up slowly, reluctantly, as if still expecting some last-minute absolution that wouldn't come. My son approached as if to hug me, but stopped when he saw my expression. "Mom," his voice broke. "I'm truly sorry." "I know," I responded, and it was true. I could see genuine regret in his eyes, see that he finally understood the magnitude of the mistake. But being sorry doesn't erase what was done. It doesn't restore the trust that was broken. It doesn't heal the betrayal that was felt. He nodded, tears flowing freely now, and turned to leave. My daughter passed by me without being able to look into my eyes, her steps heavy with the weight of guilt and shame. That gold-digger son-in-law and that gold-digger daughter-in-law followed behind, their presences diminished, their arrogance completely destroyed. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me had completely turned against them. When the door finally closed and I was alone, the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of confrontation or the strategic silence of observation. It was the silence of resolution, of closing a chapter, even if painful. I returned to my chair and sat heavily, suddenly feeling all the emotional weight of recent days, weeks, months. I'd won. I'd proven my point, protected my property, defended my dignity. But victory had a bitter taste because the price was high. The price was the innocence of believing family always means loyalty, that blood is always stronger than greed, that the children you raise will always respect who you are. This is a real story where winning doesn't necessarily mean being happy. Sometimes it just means surviving with your dignity intact. I looked at the folder of documents still on the table. These papers had been my salvation, my proof, my weapon. But they were also a constant reminder that I'd needed weapons against my own family, that it had been necessary to gather evidence, hire a lawyer, prepare a case as if going to war, because in a way, I was. A war that should never have happened, against enemies that should never have existed. I picked up the original deed again, that yellowed paper that had saved everything. 20 years ago, when I signed this document, I never imagined that one day it would be the only thing between me and the betrayal of my own children. Life has a strange way of preparing us for battles we don't know we'll face. That piece of paper was more than a deed now. It was a symbol of survival, resistance, and the absolute refusal to be erased. In the following days, the silence continued. I didn't receive calls, didn't receive messages, didn't receive visits. They were processing, just as I was. But while my processing was about healing and deciding about the future, theirs was probably about shame, regret, and the slow understanding they'd destroyed something precious that might never be rebuilt. People asked me how I was, friends who'd heard rumors of family problems. "I'm at peace," I'd respond. And it was true. It wasn't the peace of happiness, but the peace of someone who fought a fair battle and won. The peace of someone who looked into the abyss of humiliation and refused to fall. The peace of an elderly mother who proved that age isn't synonymous with weakness, that silence can be strength, and that underestimating someone can be the biggest mistake you'll ever make. The silence that came after wasn't defeat. It was reclaimed dignity, and that, of all possible victories, was perhaps the most important. Weeks passed since that devastating meeting. The beach house remained mine, exactly as it always was, but now it carried a different emotional weight. It was no longer just the symbol of my achievements, it was also the battlefield where I fought for my dignity and won. Some nights, I'd drive there alone, sit on the porch watching the sea, and reflect on everything that had happened. The sound of the waves had a calming effect, as if nature were reminding me that life continues, that storms pass, that even the deepest wounds eventually form scars. This is a real story that taught me lessons I never imagined needing to learn, especially not at my age, especially not from people I myself had brought into the world. But life doesn't ask if we're ready for its lessons. It simply delivers them and expects us to learn or be destroyed by them. I chose to learn. The first and most important lesson was about respect. I spent decades believing respect was something automatic in family relationships, that the simple fact of being a mother guaranteed a certain level of consideration and appreciation. I was wrong. Respect isn't inherited, it doesn't come automatically with titles or positions. Respect needs to be sustained day after day through actions that demonstrate you're still a whole person, capable, deserving of an active voice in decisions that affect your life. An elderly mother doesn't stop being a person for having accumulated years. In fact, those years should bring more respect, not less. But I learned that in a society that values youth over experience, productivity over wisdom, speed over reflection, being older can be seen as being less relevant. And when you're seen as less relevant, it becomes easier for others to ignore your wishes, invalidate your feelings, dismiss your opinions. This is an emotional story because it exposes this painful truth that many prefer to ignore. I also learned about the true meaning of family. Throughout my life, I carried an idealized vision of what family should be: a safe harbor, a circle of unconditional love, a place where you're valued simply for existing. Reality proved to be much more complex and, frequently, much crueler. Family, I discovered, isn't defined by blood or shared surnames. It's defined by actions, by loyalty demonstrated in difficult moments, by being present not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's not. My ungrateful daughter and ungrateful son were family by biology, but their actions showed that biology doesn't guarantee family behavior. That gold-digger son-in-law and that gold-digger daughter-in-law entered the family through marriage, but their interests were always more financial than effective. The total humiliation they tried to impose on me revealed I'd invested decades loving an idea of family that perhaps never existed the way I imagined. But perhaps the deepest lesson was about myself. For years, I defined myself primarily as a mother, as a provider, as the person who sacrificed so others could prosper. That identity was comfortable, familiar, socially approved. But when I was forced to fight for myself, when I had to choose between maintaining family peace and defending my dignity, I discovered there was much more inside me than I imagined. There was strength I didn't know I possessed, courage I didn't know I could access, a capacity to face conflict I'd always avoided. I learned that being good doesn't mean being passive, that being loving doesn't mean being a doormat, that being a mother doesn't mean being a martyr. An elderly mother can, yes, stand up and say no, not just whisper it timidly, but declare it with all the force of truth and justice. This is a real story of personal rediscovery at an age where many believe you should already be completely defined and unchangeable. As for them, my children and their spouses, I'm certain this experience marked them in ways they'll never forget. Not because I was cruel or vindictive, I was just fair and honest. But sometimes, simple and direct truth is more impactful than any elaborate punishment. They'll live with the memory that they tried to deceive their own mother, that they built an elaborate scheme based on the assumption she'd be too easy to notice. They'll live knowing they completely underestimated the woman who gave them life, who raised them, who sacrificed so much for them. That awareness won't disappear easily. It'll stay with them in quiet moments, will surface in nighttime reflections, will appear every time they look at their own children and wonder if one day they'll be treated the same way. The humiliation they felt in that room wasn't just momentary. It was a lesson engraved in each of their consciences. I received, a few weeks after the confrontation, a letter from my daughter. It was long, detailed, full of apologies and explanations. She tried to reconstruct the narrative, explain how things got out of control, how it started with legitimate concerns about my well-being and gradually transformed into something much darker. Sincerity could be read in every line, but so could justification. There were still parts where she tried to minimize, rationalize, make her actions seem more understandable than they really were. An ungrateful daughter seeking absolution, but still not completely capable of facing the totality of her actions. I responded briefly, thanking her for the letter, but making clear that words, however sincere, need to be accompanied by real changes in behavior over time. Forgiveness, if it came, would be a process, not a single event. This is an emotional story because it shows that real reconciliation requires more than apologies. It requires genuine transformation. My son was different. He showed up at my door a month later, without warning, without his wife, without any apparent agenda beyond talking. We sat in the same place where it all began, that room that had seen so much drama and pain. And for the first time in a long time, he spoke with brutal honesty about his own cowardice, about how the pressure from his sister and brother-in-law had been easier to accept than the courage to defend me. "I have no excuse, Mom," he said, tears flowing freely down his face. "I knew it was wrong. I knew from the beginning, but it was easier to go along than resist." An ungrateful son, finally finding courage, too late to avoid the damage, but perhaps in time to begin some kind of healing. I didn't promise anything that day, but I listened, and listening, in that moment, was already more than many would do. The beach house became my refuge in ways it never was before. I spent more time there, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who'd been more loyal than family. I renovated some rooms, changed some decorations, transformed the space in small but significant ways. It was a way of reclaiming that place, not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually. Each change was a declaration. This is mine, by right, by conquest, by choice. No one can take this from me. And although memories of betrayal still lived in those walls alongside happier memories, I learned it's possible to live with both. The pain of the recent past didn't erase the joy of the distant past. Both were part of the complete story, and denying either would be denying the truth of my own life. This is a real story about learning to integrate difficult experiences without letting them define you completely. As for the future of the inheritance, that subject that had motivated so much greed and betrayal, I made important decisions. I revised my will with my lawyer, creating a document that reflected not the old hopes of an idealized family, but the reality of who really demonstrated character and loyalty. I didn't completely disinherit my children. They were still my children, and some part of my maternal heart couldn't do that. But I made significant changes that ensured charitable institutions, causes I believe in, and people who'd been genuinely supportive would receive substantial parts of what I'd leave behind. The beach house, in particular, received special clauses. It wouldn't simply be sold and divided, but maintained for a time, used for specific purposes, I determined. It was my last word on the subject, engraved in legal terms that left no room for interpretation or manipulation. They'd discover all this eventually, but for now, it was my secret. My guarantee the lesson would be complete even after my death. I found myself frequently reflecting on the phrase that started it all. "We sold your house, old lady." Those words had been an attempt to diminish me, to reduce me to something disposable and irrelevant. But paradoxically, they'd triggered exactly the opposite. They'd forced me to prove my worth, not just to them, but to myself. They'd reminded me I wasn't just their mother, the grandmother of their children, the silent provider of comforts they took for granted. I was a complete person, with rights, with strength, with the capacity to fight for myself when necessary. An elderly mother, yes, but also a warrior, a survivor, a woman who wouldn't accept being erased from her own story. This is an emotional story because it shows that sometimes the worst experiences reveal the best versions of ourselves. Versions we didn't even know existed until we were forced to call them into existence. There were moments, I admit, when I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if I should have simply forgiven and forgotten, maintained family peace even if it meant swallowing my pride and accepting humiliation. These moments usually came late at night, when loneliness weighed more, when the part of me that was still a mother missed her children, even children who'd betrayed me. But then I'd remember that Sunday, those words said with so much disdain, that arrogant certainty I didn't matter enough to even be consulted about my own property. And I knew I'd done the right thing. Because teaching that lesson, however painful it was for everyone involved, was an act of love. Not the soft, comfortable love that forgives everything, but the hard, honest love that insists on standards, that demands respect, that says you can do better and must do better. The total humiliation they experienced was necessary so that perhaps, just perhaps, they could become better people. In the end, this story isn't just about a house or legal documents or family conflict. It's about human dignity. It's about each person's right, regardless of age, to be treated with respect and consideration. It's about refusing to be invisible, irrelevant, disposable. It's about finding strength in places you didn't even know existed inside you. It's about truth triumphing over manipulation, justice prevailing over greed, patience defeating arrogance. This is a real story I lived, that transformed me, that left me with scars, but also with wisdom. And if there's anything I hope others learn from it, it's this. Never underestimate someone based on age, appearance, or circumstance. Because the quiet person in the corner might be observing, learning, preparing. And when they finally speak, when they finally act, their words will have the weight of truth and their actions will have the force of justice. My children learned that lesson the hard way, and I sincerely hope, they never forget it. In the end, what remained wasn't just the legal victory or the house that stayed mine. It was the certainty that dignity has no price, that respect needs to be sustained every day, and that being a mother doesn't mean accepting disrespect from one's own children. I learned that age brings wisdom, that silence can be strength, and that it's never too late to fight for who you are. The beach house continues being mine, but more important than that, I continue being myself, whole, dignified, and owner of my own story. And you? Have you been through something similar? Have you ever felt your voice was being ignored by people who should value you? What would you do if you were in my place? If you discovered your own children tried to take from you something you conquered with so much sacrifice? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Because stories like this remind us we should never underestimate anyone, especially those who built everything with their own hands and who have much more strength than they appear to have. Until the next story.